Hello, my good friends. How are you today? May God bless you all. I will not introduce anything. You guys watch the video and feel it, then let's evaluate together.
The rain pounded against the windows of the little suburban house in Portland, Oregon, like it was trying to break in. It was late October 2025, and the air smelled of wet leaves and the faint bitterness of coffee still lingering from dinner. Sophie Carter, all of 13 years old, stood frozen in the dimly lit kitchen, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the linoleum floor. Her oversized gray hoodie hung loose over her thin frame, the sleeves damp from when she'd sprinted home through the downpour just 20 minutes ago. In her trembling hands, she clutched her phone so tight her knuckles turned white. The screen glowed faintly, casting a pale light across her freckled face as she stared at it, wide-eyed, like it might bite her. She pressed play again just to be sure she wasn't losing her mind. A low, gravelly voice crackled through her earbuds. James Sullivan, her mom's fiancé. The guy who drove a shiny red Mustang and flashed perfect smiles like he was auditioning for a toothpaste commercial. The recording was fuzzy, but the words cut through the static like a knife. She was a problem, so I took care of her. You don't need to know more. Sophie's breath hitched. She yanked the earbuds out, letting them dangle against her chest as she whispered to herself, "Oh my God, what did I just hear? Mom's gonna marry a psycho?" Her heart slammed against her ribcage, loud enough to drown out the rain for a second. She glanced around the kitchen. Everything was too normal. The fridge hummed quietly, a half-empty mug of coffee sat on the counter where her mom Laura had left it, and the flickering overhead light buzzed like it always did. But nothing felt normal anymore. Not after what Ethan, her nerdy best friend with a knack for hacking, had pulled off. He'd rigged some techie gadget to snag data from James's phone last time he was over, and this was what they'd found. Sophie's mind raced. Took care of her? That wasn't some vague business jargon. That sounded like murder. She was still standing there, rooted to the spot, when the back door creaked open. Sophie jumped, nearly dropping her phone. The clink of keys hitting the counter snapped her out of her daze, and there he was, James, stepping into the kitchen like he owned the place. His dark hair was slicked back, a little wet from the rain, and he wore that stupid leather jacket he thought made him look cool. He flashed her that $1,000,000 smile, all teeth and charm. "Hey, kiddo," he said, his voice smooth as butter. "You're up late. Everything okay?" Sophie's throat went dry. She fumbled to shove her phone behind her back, her fingers clumsy as she tried to hit the lock button. Yeah," she stammered, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Just getting some water." She took a step back, her hip bumping the counter, and winced as the edge dug into her side. James tilted his head, his blue eyes narrowing just enough to make her stomach twist. "You sure?" he said, taking a slow step closer. "You look like you've seen a ghost." The way he said it wasn't friendly anymore. It was like he was testing her, peeling back her shaky excuse layer by layer. Sophie's pulse roared in her ears. She could smell his cologne now, sharp and expensive, mixing with the damp leather of his jacket. He was too close, and her phone felt like a ticking bomb against her spine. "I'm fine," she managed, her voice cracking a little. She forced a weak smile, but it probably looked more like a grimace. Her eyes darted to the doorway leading to the living room. Where was Mom? She needed a distraction, anything to get out of this. James didn't move. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching her like a hawk sizing up a rabbit. "Good," he said finally, his smile creeping back. "Wouldn't want you stressing out over nothing." But the way his gaze lingered, it wasn't nothing. Sophie's skin prickled. Did he know? Had he seen her with the phone? Her mind spun, replaying every second since he walked in. She hadn't been fast enough to hide it, had she? Before she could figure it out, Laura's voice cut through the tension like a lifeline. "James, you coming?" she called from the living room. her tone light and oblivious. Sophie could picture her curled up on the couch, probably scrolling through wedding dress pics on her tablet like she'd been doing all week. James held Sophie's gaze for one more heartbeat, then chuckled softly. "Yeah, babe," he called back, his voice switching to that syrupy tone he used with Laura. He gave Sophie a final look, sharp, cold, like a warning, then turned and sauntered out of the kitchen, his boots thudding against the hardwood. Sophie let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding, her knees wobbling as she sank against the counter. The spilled water from her clumsy bump earlier soaked into her hoodie, but she barely noticed. Her hands shook as she pulled her phone out again, unlocking it with a swipe. She opened her chat with Ethan and typed fast. "He's on to me. That recording, it's real. He killed someone." Ethan's reply popped up almost instantly. "Chill, Soph. We need more proof. Meet me tomorrow at school." Sophie bit her lip, her eyes flicking to the window. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the streetlights cast long, eerie shadows across the yard. She squinted, her breath catching again. There, under the glow of the nearest lamppost, stood James. He wasn't moving, just standing, hands in his pockets, staring up at her bedroom window on the second floor. His face was half hidden in shadow, but she could feel his eyes boring into the house, into her. Sophie stumbled back from the window, her heart racing all over again. Was he waiting for her to slip up, or was he planning something worse? She hugged her arms around herself, the damp hoodie clinging to her skin. This wasn't just some creepy vibe anymore. This was real. And her mom, her sweet, clueless mom, was about to marry him. She bolted upstairs to her room, locking the door behind her with a soft click. The familiar mess, clothes strewn across the floor, her old guitar propped against the desk, posters of Billie Eilish peeling at the edges, didn't feel safe tonight. She climbed into bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin, but sleep was miles away. Her mind wouldn't stop. That recording, James's voice. She was a problem, so I took care of her. Who was she? And why did Sophie feel like she was next? Her phone buzzed again, another text from Ethan. "We'll figure this out. Don't freak." Easier said than done. Sophie stared at the ceiling, the rain tapping a restless rhythm against the roof. She thought about her dad, how he'd died in that car crash 5 years ago, leaving her and Mom alone. She'd promised herself back then she'd never let anyone hurt her family again. Not after that. And now here was James, waltzing into their lives with his fancy car and fake smiles, threatening to take it all away. "I don't care if Mom hates me for this," she muttered, her voice barely a whisper in the dark. "I'm not letting him win." She squeezed her eyes shut, determination hardening in her chest. Whatever James was hiding, she'd find it. She had to. "Hey guys, what would you do if you found out your mom's fiancé might be a killer?" Drop a comment below and don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started with this crazy ride. The next morning, Portland was still draped in a gray haze, the kind of damp chill that clung to your bones. Sophie barely slept, her eyes gritty and red as she dragged herself out of bed. The memory of James standing under that streetlight kept replaying in her head like a horror movie on loop. She threw on a faded denim jacket over her hoodie, grabbed her backpack, and slipped out before Laura could ask why she looked like she'd been hit by a truck. She needed answers, and she wasn't getting them from her mom. Franklin Middle School buzzed with the usual chaos. Kids shouting, lockers slamming, the sharp squeak of sneakers on polished floors. Sophie wove through the crowd, her stomach churning, until she spotted Ethan and Riley by the chain-link fence near the basketball court. Ethan, skinny and hunched over his phone, adjusted his glasses as she approached. Riley, all sharp edges with her purple-streaked hair and ripped jeans, leaned against the fence, arms crossed like she was ready to fight the world. "Spill it," Riley said the second Sophie stopped, her voice cutting through the chatter around them. "You look like crap." What happened last night? Sophie took a shaky breath, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one was listening. I heard him, she said, keeping her voice low. James, on that recording you got, Ethan, he said he took care of someone, like killed them. Riley rolled her eyes, but there was a flicker of unease in her face. You're nuts, Soph. He's just a rich dude who spoils your mom. Probably meant he fired some chick at work. Ethan didn't look up from his phone, his fingers tapping fast. Nah, it's weirder than that. I dug into his number last night after you freaked out. There's nothing online about a James Sullivan matching his vibe. No LinkedIn, no news, nada. Guy's a ghost. But... He paused, finally meeting her eyes. That number? It pinged a call to a woman named Claire Bennett 2 years ago. She went missing in Seattle. Sophie's stomach dropped. Seattle? That's what, 3 hours from here? 2 if you drive fast, Ethan said, shoving his phone in his pocket. Point is, it's sketchy as hell. A guy with a Mustang and a Rolex should have some digital footprint. This dude's scrubbed clean. Riley snorted, kicking at a pebble. So what, you're gonna play detective now? Bust out the magnifying glass and trench coat? Sophie shot her a glare. If it keeps my mom alive, yeah. Ethan grinned, a little too excited for the situation. I can dig deeper, but you owe me a burger. Deal? Deal, Sophie muttered, her mind already spinning. Claire Bennett. Missing. Seattle. It wasn't much, but it was something. Enough to prove she wasn't just paranoid. By the time she got home that afternoon, the rain had stopped, leaving the air thick with that earthy Portland smell. Laura was in the kitchen, humming some old Taylor Swift song while chopping carrots for dinner. Sophie hesitated in the doorway, watching her mom's messy ponytail bounce as she moved. She looked happy, happier than she'd been since Dad died. It made Sophie's chest ache, but it didn't change what she knew. She dropped her backpack by the table and cleared her throat. Mom, can we talk? Laura glanced up, her smile fading a little. Sure, honey. What's up? Sophie fiddled with the zipper on her jacket, picking her words carefully. Why's James paying our bills? I found some receipts in your room, like from some weird company. Laura's knife froze mid-chop. She set it down slowly, her hazel eyes narrowing. You were snooping in my stuff? No, I mean, yeah, but that's not the point, Sophie said, her voice rising. What's going on? Are we broke or something? Laura sighed, rubbing her temples like she always did when she was stressed. You don't get it, Sophie. Things have been tight since your dad... James is helping us out. He's saving us. Saving us? Sophie's hands clenched into fists. He's a liar, Mom. I heard him say he took care of someone, like, hurt them. Laura's face hardened. Not this again. You're just a kid, Soph. Stop making up stories. I'm not making it up, Sophie shouted, her voice cracking. He's dangerous, and you're too blind to see it. Laura turned away, gripping the counter so hard her knuckles whitened. Enough, she said, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. I don't want to hear it. James is good to us. End of story. Sophie opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat. Tears stung her eyes as she grabbed her backpack and stormed upstairs, slamming her door hard enough to rattle the frame. She threw herself onto her bed, burying her face in her pillow. Why wouldn't Mom listen? Was she that desperate for someone to swoop in and fix everything? Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her spiral. Ethan. Got more on Claire. Meet me at the park tomorrow. Sophie wiped her face, a flicker of hope cutting through the frustration. Maybe Ethan had something solid, something even Mom couldn't ignore. That night, James showed up again. Sophie was in the living room pretending to scroll TikTok on her phone when the doorbell rang. Laura bounced up to let him in, all smiles and giggles like a teenager with a crush. Sophie's stomach twisted as James stepped inside, his leather jacket swapped for a crisp button-up that screamed money. But he wasn't alone this time. A guy trailed behind him, tall, broad-shouldered, with a buzz cut and a snake tattoo curling up his neck. James clapped him on the back. "This is Mike, my old work buddy. Thought I'd bring him by for dinner." Mike nodded at Laura, his smile tight and fake. "Nice place you got here." "Thanks," Laura chirped, oblivious as she led them to the dining room. Sophie stayed put, her grip tightening on her phone. Something about Mike screamed trouble. Those hard eyes, the way he scanned the room like he was casing it. She slipped into the hallway, crouching behind the staircase, and strained to hear their voices over the clatter of plates. "Kid's asking too many questions," Mike muttered, low enough that Laura wouldn't catch it from the kitchen. "Boss won't like this." James's voice was calm, too calm. "I'll handle her. She's just a nosy brat." Sophie's blood ran cold. Her? They were talking about her. She pressed herself against the wall, barely breathing as Mike grunted. "Better do it fast. We've got bigger fish to fry." She peeked around the corner just in time to see James nod, his face unreadable. Laura called them to the table, and they switched back to small talk like nothing had happened. But Sophie's hands shook as she crept back to her room, locking the door behind her. This wasn't just about James anymore. He had people, dangerous people, backing him up. She grabbed her phone and fired off a group text to Ethan and Riley. "He's not just a creep. He's got people with him. Some guy named Mike. We're in deep." Her fingers hovered over the screen, her breath ragged. She'd thought James was bad enough on his own, but this was a whole new level of messed up. Things just got wild, right? Would you trust Sophie's gut or her mom's heart? Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. We've got more twists coming your way. The afternoon sun hung low over Portland, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement outside Brood Awakening, a tiny coffee shop tucked between a thrift store and a vape place downtown. Sophie sat at a wobbly table in the back, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of cocoa she hadn't touched. The smell of roasted beans and cinnamon swirled around her, but it couldn't cut through the knot in her stomach. Ethan slouched across from her, his laptop open, glasses fogged up from the steam of his latte. Riley paced nearby, her combat boots scuffing the worn wooden floor, muttering about how they were all going to end up on some true crime podcast. "Okay, spill it, Ryan," Sophie said, her voice tight as she glanced at the guy sitting next to Ethan. Ryan was a mess, unshaven with greasy brown hair spilling out of a faded mariner's cap, and a flannel shirt that looked like it hadn't seen a washer in weeks. He'd been James's co-worker years ago, back when they both hauled cargo up and down I-5, and now he was their last shot at cracking this thing wide open. Ryan leaned forward, his voice low and raspy, like he was scared the walls might snitch. "James didn't just kill Claire Bennett. He was working for someone, a big shot in Seattle who runs everything, drugs, money, you name it. Claire found out too much, some ledger she wasn't supposed to see, and James made her disappear. I bailed when I figured it out. Didn't want my name on that list." Sophie's mouth went dry. "A big shot? Like what, some mafia dude?" "Close enough," Ryan said, his eyes darting to the window. "James isn't the top dog. He's the cleanup guy. Does the dirty work so the real boss stays clean." Ethan whistled low, tapping at his keyboard. "That explains why he's a ghost online. Someone's wiping his slate." Riley stopped pacing, her arms crossing tight. "So Sophie's mom's marrying a hitman for some shady Seattle kingpin? That's next level screwed up." Sophie barely heard them. Her mind was racing, piecing it together. James's creepy calm, that Mike guy, the way he'd said, "I'll handle her." This wasn't just about Claire anymore. It was bigger, and her mom was smack in the middle of it. She needed more, something solid, something Laura couldn't brush off. Back home that night, Sophie waited until Laura was in the shower, the faint hum of water echoing down the hall. She slipped into her mom's room, heart pounding as she rummaged through the cluttered dresser. Bills, receipts, a half-empty pack of gum. Then her fingers brushed something stiff. A photo, old and creased, tucked under a pile of socks. She pulled it out, and her breath caught. Two college girls grinned at the camera, arms slung around each other, the Space Needle looming in the background. One was Laura, younger, with that same messy ponytail. The other, Sophie squinted. The wavy blonde hair, the freckles. She'd seen that face in Ethan's files. Claire Bennett. Her hands shook as she stared at it. Mom knew Claire. She flipped the photo over, scrawled in faded ink. Laura and Claire, UW 98, besties forever. Sophie's chest tightened. This changed everything. She didn't wait. She stormed downstairs, photo in hand, and burst into the bathroom just as Laura stepped out, towel wrapped around her. Sophie, what the... Laura started, but Sophie cut her off, shoving the picture in her face. You knew her, Mom! Sophie's voice cracked, loud and raw. Claire Bennett, the girl James killed, and you're still with him? Laura froze, water dripping from her hair onto the tiles. Her face went pale, then crumpled. I thought she just left town, she stammered, her voice breaking. James said she was fine, that she moved away. I didn't know, Soph, I swear. You didn't know? Sophie shouted, tears burning her eyes. Or you didn't want to know. You're so desperate for him to fix our lives that you ignored this? Laura sank onto the edge of the tub, clutching the towel like it could hold her together. I couldn't. She trailed off, sobbing quietly. And for a second, Sophie almost felt bad. Almost. But she couldn't stop now. She had to end this. The plan came together fast. Ethan rigged a tiny recorder, borrowed it from my cousin who's way too into spy movies, he'd said with a grin, and handed it to Sophie the next day. Riley wasn't thrilled. You're going to get yourself killed, Soph, she warned, but she still agreed to help. That night, James was coming over for dinner, and Sophie was ready. She opened the door when he arrived, forcing a smile that felt like plastic. Hey, James, can we talk? Alone? He raised an eyebrow, his leather jacket creaking as he stepped inside. Sure, kiddo, he said, that smooth smile sliding into place. What's on your mind? Sophie led him to the living room, her palms sweaty as she slipped the recorder into her hoodie pocket. Laura was in the kitchen, banging pots around, oblivious. Sophie sat on the couch, James across from her in the armchair, his legs crossed like he owned the damn place. She took a deep breath. I know you're hiding something, she said, locking eyes with him. His smile didn't budge, but his gaze sharpened. That's so. What am I hiding, detective? Claire Bennett, she said, watching his face. For a split second, something flickered in his eyes, something dark. I know you dated her. I know she disappeared. I know you were the last one with her. James leaned back, chuckling low. You've been busy. Where'd you dig up that old dirt? Doesn't matter, Sophie snapped, her voice steady despite the hammering in her chest. I've got proof. Confess now, or I go to the cops. He stared at her, silent, then burst out laughing. A cold, jagged sound that made her skin crawl. You think you're clever, huh? He stood up, towering over her, and Sophie's stomach flipped. You've got nothing, kid, just a big mouth. She didn't flinch. Say it, James. You killed her. Say it. He lunged, fast as a snake, grabbing her by the throat and slamming her back against the couch. You little brat, he hissed, his breath hot on her face. Yeah, I did it. Took her out because she wouldn't shut up. And your mom's next if you don't back off. Sophie clawed at his hand, gasping, her free fingers fumbling for the recorder. She hit play, and his voice blared out, tinny but clear. Yeah, I did it. James froze, his grip loosening just enough for her to twist free. She stumbled back, coughing, as Laura burst in from the kitchen, a frying pan in her hand. What the hell is going on? Laura yelled, her eyes wild. James spun toward her, his face twisting. She's lying, babe, he started, but Sophie cut him off. He confessed, Mom. Listen. She replayed it, James's words echoing through the room. Laura dropped the pan with a clang, her hands flying to her mouth. You You killed her? Laura whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. Claire? My friend? James's jaw tightened, his calm mask shattering. She was a loose end, he snarled, and you two are about to be... Before he could finish, Sophie bolted for the phone on the coffee table, dialing 911 with shaking hands. Help! He's gonna kill us! She screamed into the receiver as James lunged again, this time with a knife pulled from his jacket. Laura shrieked, throwing herself between them, and Sophie ducked just as sirens wailed outside, close, loud, real. James froze, the blade glinting under the living room lights, his eyes darting to the window. Red and blue flashed through the curtains. It was over. Sophie grabbed her mom's arm, pulling her back as the front door burst open. Police! Drop the weapon! An officer barked, gun raised. James swore, the knife slipping from his hand as he raised his arms, cornered. Sophie clung to Laura, both of them trembling. I told you, Mom, she whispered, her voice raw. I told you. Whoa, that was intense. Did you see that twist coming? Subscribe now and tell me your favorite moment. We're heading to the big finale next. 3 months later, the air in Boise, Idaho felt different. Crisp and dry, nothing like the soggy weight of Portland's endless rain. Sophie stood on the balcony of their new rental house, a squat little 2-story with peeling blue paint and a view of the foothills turning gold under the January sun. The wind tugged at her hair, now tied back in a loose ponytail, and she zipped her puffy jacket a little higher against the chill. Downstairs, the faint clatter of pans and the smell of chocolate chip cookies drifted up from the kitchen, Laura's first real baking session since everything went down. For the first time in forever, Sophie felt something close to peace. The past few weeks had been a blur. After that night, the knife, the sirens, James's snarling face as the cops dragged him out in cuffs, life had flipped upside down. They'd packed up and left Portland fast, like they were running from a ghost. Boise wasn't fancy, but it was quiet, far enough from James and his messed-up world to breathe again. Sophie leaned against the railing, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead, and let her mind wander. She'd done it. She'd saved her mom. But it still didn't feel totally real. The balcony door slid open with a squeak, and Laura stepped out, wiping flour-dusted hands on her jeans. She ditched the tired cardigans for a soft green sweater, and her eyes, still a little shadowed, had a spark Sophie hadn't seen in months. Cookies are almost done, Laura said, leaning next to her. You thinking about something out here? Sophie shrugged, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Just enjoying this. No creepy dudes staring up at my window, you know? Laura let out a small laugh, but it faded quick. She rested a hand on Sophie's shoulder, her fingers warm through the jacket. I'm sorry I didn't listen, Soph, she said, her voice soft but heavy. You saved us. I was so caught up in him, in what I thought he could fix, that I didn't see what you did. Sophie turned, meeting her mom's eyes. They were wet, glistening in the late afternoon light, and for a second she saw the Laura from that old photo with Claire. Young, hopeful, before life got hard. We saved each other, Mom, Sophie said, her throat tightening. I just couldn't let him take you away too. Not after Dad. Laura pulled her into a hug, tight and fierce, like she was afraid to let go. Sophie hugged back, burying her face in her mom's sweater, the faint scent of vanilla mixing with the cold air. They stood there for a while, the wind whistling around them, until Laura pulled back, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. I owe you so much, kiddo, she said, her smile wobbly but real. You're tougher than I ever was. Nah, Sophie said, grinning a little. I just watched too many crime shows. Laura laughed again, louder this time, and it felt like a weight lifting off the balcony. Come on, she said, nudging Sophie toward the door. Those cookies aren't going to eat themselves. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang, a sharp chime that made Sophie jump out of habit. She was sprawled on the living room couch, half watching some dumb reality show on their ancient TV, a plate of warm cookies balanced on her lap. Laura poked her head out from the kitchen, frowning. "You expecting someone?" "Nope," Sophie said, setting the plate down and hopping up. She peeked through the blinds, her pulse ticking up for a second. Old instincts die hard, then relaxed. "It's a cop car, but it's just one guy. Looks chill." Laura came over, wiping her hands on a dish towel as Sophie opened the door. A tall guy in a crisp uniform stood there, his badge glinting in the sunlight. "Afternoon," he said, tipping his head. "I'm Detective Diaz. Work the Sullivan case with Portland PD. Mind if I come in?" "Sure," Laura said, stepping aside, though her voice had a nervous edge. Sophie followed them to the kitchen, where Diaz pulled out a chair and sat, setting a manila folder on the table. "Just wanted to update you," he said, flipping the folder open. "James cut a deal, spilled everything about his boss in Seattle, some real estate tycoon named Victor Grayson. Drugs, money laundering, the works. We're closing in on him now thanks to what you gave us, Sophie." Sophie blinked, leaning against the counter. "Me?" Diaz nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "That recording you got? Pure gold. And the stuff your buddy Ethan pulled off James's phone, photos, messages. It tied him to Claire Bennett's murder and then some. Kid, you've got guts. Most grown-ups wouldn't have pulled that off." Laura squeezed Sophie's arm, pride flickering in her eyes. "She's something else," she said softly. "Understatement," Diaz said, standing up. "Anyway, thought you'd want to know James is locked up tight and Grayson's days are numbered. You two can sleep easy now." "Thanks," Sophie said, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. Diaz gave a quick nod, tipped his hat again, and headed out, leaving the folder behind like a trophy. When the door clicked shut, Laura sank into a chair, staring at the folder. "I can't believe I fell for him," she murmured, almost to herself. "Claire. Me. How did I not see it?" Sophie slid into the seat across from her, pushing the cookie plate between them. "He was good at lying, Mom. Fooled a lot of people. But it's over now." Laura reached for a cookie, breaking it in half. "Yeah," she said, taking a deep breath. "You and me, we're starting over. No more ghosts." A week later, Sophie stood on the balcony again, the sunset painting the sky in streaks of red and orange. Boise wasn't Portland. No drizzle, no towering evergreens, but it was growing on her. The new school was fine, the kids were nice enough, and she'd even started strumming her guitar again, something she hadn't touched since Dad died. Downstairs, Laura laughed at something on the phone, probably her sister Aunt Jen planning a visit. It was small stuff, normal stuff, but it felt huge. Laura stepped out, a mug of tea in her hands, and leaned against the railing next to Sophie. "What's on your mind, kiddo?" Sophie smiled, a real one this time, not the forced kind she'd faked for months. "Just happy, I guess. No more looking over my shoulder." Laura set the mug down and wrapped an arm around her. "I owe you so much, Soph. You saved me, from James, from myself. I'm going to be better. More time with you, no one else getting in the way." Sophie leaned her head on her mom's shoulder, the warmth seeping through her jacket. "I just want you to be happy, Mom. That's all I ever wanted." "I already am," Laura whispered, her voice catching. "Right here, with you." They stood there as the sun dipped below the hills, the sky fading to purple. No more James, no more secrets, just them, a mom and her kid, figuring it out together. Sophie closed her eyes, letting the quiet sink in. She'd fought for this, and it was worth every second. And that's a wrap, folks. What did you think of Sophie's journey? Hit subscribe and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. See you in the next story.